Since halo rings have come up, Jesse, I'm going to show you how to make a halo. And this time, I'm going to train you opposite of the way I normally would. Normally, you learn the long hand, and then you learned shorthand tricks that you can use sometimes. In this particular case, I'm going to teach you the other direction. And because the reason I'm doing that is the shorthand way to learn actually makes you have to think about a lot of things that will become an issue when you make it longhand. So it'll just get you trained to know where things go, if that makes sense. So what we're going to do, we're going to look at a picture of a couple of halo rings. This video is only going to talk about the halo itself. We'll talk about attaching it to the shank in another video because that's going to be something entirely different. So there's lots of different halos. So just like we have shanks that are common prong or bead set, we're going to have the same thing in halos. So you can see this one is bead set. It has that metal wall versus this one is common prong. I think I even found an image of one that's like, this is, there's bead set with mill grain. This one's, you can see, is fishtail set. There's big stones on the side. There's small stones on the side. There's some where the diamonds sit really close to the center. There's some where there's a little bit of a gap. So just like anything we're building, you kind of want to look at what we're doing and what our concerns are. So when we're building a halo, I normally do it longhand. It's habit, but you'll want to go to cluster builder. So under here, builder, it's the one that looks like a little pear shape with diamonds around it. Okay. So the only thing that you'll need to start is your center diamond. So let's go to gems. This first one, gem loader. I'm going to put in about a 1 carat, so a 6.5 millimeter round, just to kind of get us started. Okay. Again, I'll go to builder and click here, or again, it'll be in our history. So you'll put your center gem in this box. The reason I'm starting us here is because of everything you have to fill out. It's going to make you really think about what the halo looks like. So again, when you go to build it longhand, you'll know where to put all your lines, all your curves, because you'll be used to thinking about these specific dimensions. So the first thing it's going to ask you is the gap between the diamond and where your gems start. So ideally, what most of our customers prefer, in fact, let's go to Google here. All right, you'll see a trend when I look at halo rings. Here, these are all different designers. It looks like the diamonds are directly next to the center diamond, right? They're as close as possible. Most people don't like a gap like this, or if they have a gap, it's not intentional. See, right next to the diamond, pretty much all the way across the line. Here's our problem. We need to put big prongs on a big center stone. So the bigger the center diamond, the bigger the prong. So our challenge is figuring out, I'm just going to put in a, where am I here? I'm going to put in a head for now, just kind of something generic, okay? How I'm going to get those diamonds that close and still have room for this prong. So there's a couple different ways that we can do that. So that's why I have these pictures here for. So if you think about it, a bead set wall on the inside buys you some space, because how wide is a bead set wall? About 0.4 millimeters, right? So that buys you a gap between the center diamond and the edge. This is a really sneaky one that a lot of people don't think of. Having a cushion-shaped halo around a round diamond, your gems, see how they kind of jut out here? Perfect spot for a prong. Beautiful. It allows these to sit really, really close. Here I have just unnaturally small center stone prongs. We don't want to do that, but what we do have are large side diamonds. If you think about the gap between the two diamonds, how they make this kind of scallop shape, that gap gets bigger as the stones get larger, right? Two tiny diamonds, that gap is itty bitty. Big stones have a big triangular shape here that I can squeeze a prong in. My other option is to do double prongs. Again, you can see I have two smaller prongs that kind of equal one larger prong. So I'm basically getting away with what would have been in this quadrant. And then if we look really close, I don't know how close you can see on this one, but you'll see these are common prong, one set of prongs between each stone. And then look what happens here when we get to the prong. Two prongs. So basically, they just left an awkward gap so that prong could sit in there. Or again, our secondary option, leave a gap between the center and the prong. We don't want it. Most customers don't want to do that. So if you remember our rules of, I'm kind of going to get that out of the way for a second. If you remember our rules for metal, typically around our diamonds, we have like that 0.2 millimeter gap where it's just like metal that no one will ever notice. It's a pretty good rule of where to start your halo, because if you think about it, I'll still have metal coming inward, so it'll look like the halo goes all the way to the center stone. So if I'm doing a normal ring, I'm going to do, I'm going to come type in this box, 0.2. The halo is also normally about a millimeter south of the girdle. So I believe this is saying the girdle of the halo stones. So really we want it like 1.3 because that gives you room for the crown of the diamond. Okay, so I've just basically filled in these two. I'm going to put in some random choices for down here so you can kind of see what we're working with. I'm going to hit add gems. That's not what I wanted to do. Undo. We're going to hit this use maximum gem. Okay, so add gems. So I'm adding 1 millimeter stones 0.2 millimeters away from that head. Okay, kind of see what happened there. They could even come up a hair taller. That won't be the case in larger stones because if you think about it, the gap here to here changes. I really wish that this would be table to girdle because that's really what I want, right? So really they'd be up here, but we're not going to worry about that for right now. So that was 1 millimeter. I'm going to take you to the exact opposite side of the spectrum. 5 millimeters going around it, okay? So you'll also notice the shape of the halo changes, okay? So this gets a lot more scallopy as the stones get larger. Versus when they were smaller, it's a little bit easier to give it that like perfectly round shape. Here's the good news, bad news. So smaller stones are harder to fit the center stone prongs in. I mean, look, you can kind of see how it's digging in there. But it's easier to make a pretty shape. Versus if I do some really large stones. It's really easy to fit the prongs in. They're not in a great spot. I'd probably rotate those. You see how this gap is really big? I could easily fit a prong in there. But I get kind of a weird shape. This particular time, I ended up with like an even number. But what happens a lot of times, let's go back, I think we used 5s last time. It's a personal pet peeve of mine when things aren't symmetrical, okay? So do you see how this has like 2 stones versus that has 1? There's just something really unappealing about that to me. And so visually it's not exactly pretty, but here's where it becomes an issue. I have a round diamond here. Let's say they wanted a cushion shaped halo. We can't have a number of stones that's not divisible by 4. Does that make sense? You end up with some things that end up looking really weird because it needs to be even on all 4 sides. Plus, it makes it a lot easier to put your prongs, right? Because you want your prongs, your center stone prongs, to be mirrored. Well, here they're cutting into a stone, and here they're basically like in the stone's gap. So it makes it a lot easier to lay everything out if your number of stones is at least an even number, at best a number divisible by 4. So this is 7, so it's neither. Okay, so now we've been doing it 0.2 from the center. Let's talk about bead set rings, right? Because you have that mill-grain edge. Everything becomes a non-issue because even if you did it, let's even say 0.5. Now, obviously, we don't want 5 millimeters. Let's pick a normal size stone. Let's even do 1.5 here, okay? Look at how much space I have to put my prongs for the center stone in. And if you think about it, all right, we're going back to bead set rings, right? There's a gap between the stone and the wall that's 0.15 millimeters, right? And then the wall is like 0.4. So if you think about it that way, look, my wall is perfectly hugging that, but look at how much room I have to fit a prong. Okay, so we're just talking kind of, again, logistics at this point, but that's why I wanted to go over use the cluster builder, because I think things will be a little bit easier. Okay, so we've talked about a gap you would have for prongs, a gap you would have for milgrain, a gap you would have for someone's personal preference. Maybe for some reason they like that. That's all going to affect this number here. This one, the physical number will change, but 99% of the halo rings that we have out there, the table is a millimeter away from the girdle of the stones, about that gap. And again, you could go on Google Image and see that's pretty much true for most of them. It's like just enough gap that the center sits up, but not so much of a gap that the center looks distorted. All right. So now we're going to talk about this button. This is angle. Let's go back and look at our pictures. A lot of the time, they're going to be flat, so that's going to be a non-issue. However, where was that image? If you, this isn't a great shot, but if you look, see how these are tilted down? These, if you look closely, are tilted down. Let's look at some other images here, just see if I can get you a better idea. This is definitely tilted down. See how it kind of angles away from the center stone? That's pretty flat. That's maybe like a very, very slight angle. You know, flat. Look at that. Definitely tilted. Again, it's just something to kind of keep in mind. The good news, bad news is you can't exactly measure the angle, but you can definitely get a pretty good idea. So let's say 15 degrees. You'll kind of see what that looks like. That's what we saw in most of the tilted ones, right? Like definitely no more than 15. For like the one that was like barely tilted, it might be like 5 or 10. Yeah, see 5, you can't even see the difference. So it is really rare that I use anything over 10 or 15 degrees like that. I mean, that's just barely tilted enough. Another fun fact, this kind of allows you space to kind of like sneak a prong in as well. Okay, so we've done a couple things. I'm going to move this to 0. We'll start over. I'm going to make these like 1/3s because, again, that's a really popular stone size. This is a pet peeve of mine, 17 stones. What I would do, I would just make this 18. There's gonna be enough gap. I bet this is still more than 0.15 millimeters in there. I'll show you how to measure that, not in this video. We're not worried about this at this time. So now I have 18. So a number that is not divisible by 4, but is at least divisible by 2. So I'm gonna put my center prongs in here. So I could use these two if I wanted. My only complaint is it doesn't angle down, and angle down is definitely helpful. So let's grab this. I'm going to make this a little shorter. I find that matrix tends to make our stones a little smaller than we need. That's really probably a good size for a 1 millimeter. And nudge. So if you remember, there's a nudge on our prong builder when we have lots of small stones, and normally we set it at 20% because it's sharing too. This time we're going to do 0.3. I don't know why one's a percentage, one's a millimeter. I can't answer that to you, but 0.3 is a pretty good rule of thumb for a center stone. And then I'm just changing the head angle. Do you see what's happening in this perspective view? So it was like this. See how it's like cutting into our stones pretty hard? I'm tapering it in. I don't want to taper it in too far for Geber's sake, but like just enough. I mean, that's not much more than a prong would cover. And then what I'm going to do, ungroup all of this. I don't need this under bezel wire. And then again, Personal pet peeve. Let's make this as attractive as possible. So I've got one prong. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get it where I want it. Because I have an even number of stones, I can mirror it, and if one's in the right spot, the others will. I can't quad flip it. Wait, no, I can quad flip it. Can I? Yes, I can quad flip it. I can't rotate copy it. That'll make more sense in a minute. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to rotate this so the prong is directly in between these two stones, or as close as possible. Okay, so now you see in perspective, it's basically cutting into each one just a hair. Then I'm going to mirror and mirror. If the stones were divisible by 4, this would be like at a perfect 45-degree angle, right? Technically, if you want to get really picky, these aren't like a perfect head because they're kind of squished in this view, and there's a bigger gap here. But it lays better for the jeweler, for these stones. Most people looking down will never see that difference. But again, everything's perfect. Even number of stones. Also, again, depending on how particular you are, I think it's nice that this and this match. Okay. Now we need to make everything solid. Oh, no, you know what? While we're on the prong front, let's add our prongs. So let's select those. I'm right-clicking in Gem 03. I'm going to F6. Let's put in our prongs. So let's use our normal style prongs. We don't need to do 30, just 20 nudge. Okay. 0.55. Let's make our height match our width. That's a pretty good rule of thumb. So even though we had a 0.2 millimeter gap from the center stone and these side stones, look at how close they are. And then I'm going to show you another command that's new. So we need to make this solid. I'm going to go to F6. I'm going to go to, ooh, it's not in here. Well, I'm going to show you something that's a little different, but that you could use in a pinch. Channel builder. I know that sounds crazy because channels are for cutting, but, you know, also, you know, says who. So I could change my width. I know I need 0.2 millimeters outside, which happens to be the exact distance from here to there. I like to give it like a little extra, sometimes, at least on the interior. But in a real pinch, who's to say that you can't just, you know, run a cutter? We're going to do things a little prettier, so we want at least 0.2 millimeters off of each stone. So I could do through point and bring this to here, and then offset that 0.2, right? Or 0.15, really, whatever works best. 0.2 looks so far. I'm probably going to change the size of my prongs just so it doesn't look so empty out there. The inner one, I'm normally going to make more than 0.2, and I'll tell you why. When someone looks at the ring from an angle, I don't want it to look like there's a gap. So I'll normally do like a 0.3. So there's like a little overlap from the center and the sides. Once you have these 2 lines, you could build a profile and sweep 2. You could extrude curve. We don't want it to go to both sides, just one side, and bring it down to basically the height of your choice, normally 1.3 to 1.5 millimeters. You have a couple choices there. So for ease, I'm just going to do that. That's basically our halo. If you wanted to be more particular about the shape, let's turn a lot of things off. I'm basically going to turn everything off but my 2 outermost lines. I could build my own profile, right? I could copy this down, make it 1.5 millimeters long, draw lines here and here, or you know what? Maybe I even want it to be kind of angled, in which case I would draw a shape like that and then sweep to it. So I have lots of choices. Certainly no right or wrong, but again, this is just kind of showing you really quick how to make a halo. Just like a band, all the same rules apply. If you were doing bead set, you would make it wider so you'd have that bead set wall. So let's talk about why you wouldn't necessarily always use the cluster builder. Let's talk about potential problems. So this is a good one. It puts the stones in a perfect shape or perfect gap around the center stone, and this is cushion shaped with a round center. That wouldn't necessarily work. Although, let's talk about using our problem solving skills. What I might do is I might put in, let's get rid of basically all of this. What I might do is grab a cushion and make it 6.5 by 6.5. It doesn't really matter that it looks like it's a freaky height because we're not really using it. And again, it could be a smaller gap now that it's a cushion. It could even be like really it could be 0 if we wanted. And then we could add our gems. You see what happened there? Personal pet peeve, I'd make sure there's a stone in the corner because I think it makes it look more cushion shaped. But same thing could apply if maybe it had a square halo. You could just put a princess cut diamond, a square diamond in there. That's 6.5 millimeters. Add our gems. So here's where you can see having, you want that number divisible by 4, you have weird corners. It's easier when the stones are smaller. Why is that? Why is it easier to tile a powder room with smaller stones if you don't want to have to cut any, or smaller tiles if you don't want to have to cut a tile? Small spaces, like something that's only 6.5 millimeters in diameter, it's a lot easier to lay things out evenly in a even number the smaller they are, right? Because you can manipulate the gaps between them, and it would be spread out over more stones than if you had fewer large stones. Because if you start manipulating gaps in larger stones, you have fewer of them to to kind of spread the pain, if that makes sense. So if you have 20 little stones and you need to make them 0.1 millimeter gap bigger than normal across 20, no big deal. But 1 millimeter gaps is still a big gap overall. So if you had to spread that same gap across 5 stones, now it's 5 times the gap. A 0.5 millimeter extra gap across those stones is really, really obvious. So definitely the smaller the stones, the easier it is to get everything to lay out nicely. So here we kind of talked about cheating the system by throwing in a different shape. But what are other scenarios in which it just will not work? Freaky shaped halos. Let's look. Sorry, my stomach is growling. I'm very hungry today. I don't know if you can even hear that in the video. I'm gonna find a weird halo if it kills me. Well, here's a good example. Pear-shaped diamonds. There is a pear-shaped option, but it puts in like a generic pear shape. I've never seen 2 pear shapes that are shaped the same. So you're probably going to have to trace that diamond. So let's look here. Well, these are all renderings, so they're all exactly the same. But sometimes they're like really short and squatty. Sometimes this end is really, okay, here we go. You can see how much that comes in versus some of them are fatter, some of them are longer. This one has like a flat butt. What's that about? This one is more bulbous. Okay, see how this is straight? This is bulbous. I've, again, never seen 2 pear shapes ever in my life. Like, what the hell shape is that? That match each other. So you're going to have to actually trace that pear shape. Look at this versus that. So even if you scaled it up, I mean, this is not the same shape as that. That's flat. Yeah, you're going to have to put that in by hand. But now the new trend is also crazy looking halos. So thankfully they're not as common. Definitely okay, like this. You wouldn't be able to use that to build this or this. So you'll have to learn longhand, but for now, the cluster builder will definitely help. So again, it just basically puts the stones there. You go forward just like you would on a wedding band from there. You add your prongs, you give it a solid metal. Maybe it's channel, maybe it's bead set, maybe it's, whatever you want. But the halo itself, you can do a kind of a generic one with this. If you had a freaky shape, you'd probably want to do a longhand. That'll be the next video.